Chapter 1. They said the Sentinel commander never smiled. Keep your distance, the other guards warned me. Speak only when spoken to, and even then, barely. His eyes see everything you'd rather hide. I thought I understood, until I met him. Kael stands on the northern watchtower platform most evenings, shoulders rigid beneath his commander's cloak, silver clasps catching the last light. Officers approach with reports, mouths forming urgent words, hands gesturing toward distant tree lines. But he only watches their faces, tracking movements with predatory stillness. No reaction when fists slam on the parapet stone. No turn of the head when someone shouts a warning from below. It is not the calm of a warrior accustomed to danger. It is the quiet of a man locked behind glass, watching a world he cannot fully enter. I have spent enough years tending the broken to recognize wrongness hidden beneath strength. Fever lurking under cold skin. Fractures concealed by steady gaits. This feels like that same terrible recognition, a wound everyone has learned to ignore. My attention catches on the way he tilts his head, always the same angle, and something deep in my chest pulls tight like a caught thread. I am only a border guard, a beater who survived by being useful without being noticed. Yet when duty stations me beside him during a summit gathering, close enough to feel the heat radiating through his leather armor, my hand lifts before thought can stop it. One gentle touch, one forbidden brush against the side of his neck, and the perfect silence surrounding our commander begins to fracture. Walls remember everything. That was the first truth I learned in the mountain villages. Our barracks were built of quarried granite, stacked by engineers whose names faded generations ago. During winter storms, when wind howled through the valley, I would press my palms against the cold stone and imagine I could feel the echoes trapped there, arguments between long-dead soldiers, prayers whispered before forgotten battles, songs no one remembered the words to anymore. Beaters like me were the reliable echoes in those stones. Steady, unremarkable, assigned to posts based on competence rather than bloodline. My father traded me to the Border Corps when I was 15. They needed someone with sharp eyes and steady hands, and I had both. I lasted 7 years at the Southern Garrison, moving from watch duty to supply management to wounded transport. I learned to see patterns others missed, which soldiers would crack under pressure, which supplies would spoil before spoiling became visible, where fights would break out before the first punch flew. It was a useful skill, this pattern sense of mine, until the day it became dangerous. A captain's mount went lame during maneuvers. The horse was valuable, the captain more so, and the garrison veterinarian was 3 days' ride away. The animal screamed, leg twisted at an angle that made even hardened soldiers look away. Too many voices, too much panic. I saw the problem before anyone else did, not in the leg everyone focused on, but in the way the horse held its weight, the specific cant of its shoulder. The break is higher, I said, quiet but certain. If you set the leg without addressing the shoulder displacement, the bone will heal crooked and the horse will never carry weight again. No one listened. The ranking officer, a grizzled alpha who'd seen 30 years of service, grabbed the leg to wrench it straight. I saw what would happen a breath before it did. Stop. The word ripped from my throat. You'll shatter the joint, pull from the shoulder first, then guide the leg. The crack echoed off the canyon walls. The horse's scream was worse. When the animal had to be put down 3 days later, limping and feverish despite their best efforts, they traced the failure back to my warning. Called it a curse. A beater with delusions of knowledge, interfering where she didn't belong. I learned what happens to people who see too much and speak too loudly. After that garrison cast me out, others took me in, always temporarily, always warily. A supply depot that needed infantry clerks. A training outpost that required extra hands. A commander's household where I cleaned armor and pretended not to notice things. Each place taught me a new way to be invisible. Eyes down, mouth shut, hands busy. I stopped speaking when I saw wrongness. Stopped reaching toward injuries or imbalances before they became obvious to everyone else. I still felt it. That tug beneath my ribs when someone's gait was wrong, when metal was stressed beyond safe limits, when a situation was balanced on the edge of breaking. I just learned to ignore it. By the time I reached the Sentinel's keep, my life had been worn down to fits and starts between other people's needs. I arrived with a travel-stained pack, dust in my hair, and the stubborn hope that a remote posting meant fewer chances to interfere with fate. The keep rose from the mountain ridge like a crown of broken teeth, all towers and battlements carved from the same granite as the peaks themselves. Smoke from forge fires stained the sky permanent gray. Wolves, Real ones, not just the ceremonial kind, howled from the kennels at dawn, their cries bouncing off walls that had witnessed 3 centuries of blood and duty. Inside, I became one more shadow in leather and wool. We border guards lived in the eastern barracks, where cold seeped through stone no matter the season. Days began with the clash of the warning bell and the thunder of boots on stairs. We ran drills until our lungs burned, maintained equipment until our hands cramped, stood watch until our legs forgot how to bend. It was easy in such a place to disappear into routine. That suited me perfectly. But disappearing did not mean I stopped seeing. The first time I saw Kael, I was carrying dispatches past the open training yard. I didn't need to be told who he was. He moved through sword forms as if the blade were an extension of his arm, each strike precise and controlled. Broad-shouldered and tall, dark hair pulled back in a practical knot, face set in lines of absolute concentration. Other soldiers trained around him, steel clashing in patterns I could hear from 50 paces. But Kael didn't flinch when blades met behind him. Didn't turn when someone shouted a warning about a dropped shield. His gaze tracked the opponents in front of him with perfect focus, but there was something absent in his awareness, like a map missing a crucial territory. He didn't react to sounds unless they came with movement he could see. I stopped walking, transfixed despite myself. An officer barked orders from the yard's edge, gesturing sharply. Kael's eyes flicked to the man's hands, reading meaning from motion rather than voice. When another soldier spoke behind him, some comment about formation spacing, Kael continued his form, oblivious, until the speaker stepped into his line of sight and repeated whatever had been said. The others had learned to work around it, to approach from the front, to use hand signals, to make themselves visible before making noise. They called him different things in different contexts. The silent sentinel, the watchful commander, stone face. In the barracks, some whispered that he'd been wounded in a border skirmish years ago, that whatever injury had stolen his hearing had also made him more dangerous. A man who couldn't be distracted by sounds could focus with absolute clarity on what he could see. Some said it made him the perfect commander for a remote post like this, where words mattered less than walls and warriors. Others said it made him isolated, unreachable, easier to control for those who knew how to position themselves in his line of sight. I watched him and saw neither advantage nor tragedy. I saw a man who had built an entire way of existing around a single missing sense. The way he positioned himself with walls at his back. The way he watched mouths when people spoke, tracking meaning through lip movement and expression. The way his jaw tightened a half-second before arguments escalated, as though he could read anger in posture and breathing. Loneliness clung to him like morning frost. In the days that followed, I glimpsed him in passing more often than seemed coincidental for a mere border guard and a fortress commander. On the battlements at sunset, conferring with scouts. In the armory, inspecting new shipments of steel. In the chapel, kneeling before the altar with head bowed, lips still. Each time, that old unwelcome awareness stirred in me, the one that had destroyed my career once already. When a stable hand burned his hand on a forged coal, I felt the sharp sting before he cried out. My fingers moved on instinct, guiding his hand to the water trough, knowing exactly how long to keep it submerged, which angle would ease the worst damage. The blister barely formed. He called it luck. I called it a reminder to keep my mouth shut. When a senior guard began favoring his right leg, his gait just slightly altered. I knew his hip would lock completely within a fortnight. I said nothing. When I delivered water to the strategy room and an advisor coughed into his sleeve with a particular wet rasp, my skin prickled with certainty that the cough would become fever within 3 days. I kept my eyes down and left. It was not my place. It had never been my place. And yet, every time I saw Kael's profile, that careful, controlled expression, the way he held himself slightly apart even in crowds, the knowing in my chest grew sharper, more insistent. Something is wrong, it whispered. Not with his body, with the silence itself. His deafness was not natural. It didn't have the smooth quality of something born into him. It felt constructed, deliberate, like cloth stretched over a frame to hide what lay beneath. The officers called it fate. The soldiers called it old wounds. The servants called it the price of duty. But the longer I observed him, careful, always careful to remain unnoticed, the more certain I became. Whatever sealed his ears wasn't given by time or trauma. It was placed there, intentionally, like a lock fitted to a door. I lay awake at night on my narrow bunk in the barracks, listening to the wind outside and the soft snores of other guards, trying to push the certainty away. I reminded myself of the lame horse, of the accusations that followed my last interference. I repeated the promise I'd made when I'd accepted this posting. Keep your head down. Do your duty. Never, ever interfere again. Walls remember everything. So do scars. But as the season turned and frost began painting the battlements silver each dawn, another truth became impossible to ignore. If I could feel wrongness others refused to acknowledge, if my instincts were the only tools I truly possessed in this world, then perhaps some wounds weren't meant to be left alone, especially when they belonged to the man whose silence protected an entire border region from threats he could never fully hear coming. Chapter 2. The council chamber emptied in waves. First the visiting dignitaries, leaving in a rustle of formal cloaks and wounded pride over some negotiation that hadn't gone their way. Then the senior officers, voices raised in debate that Kael couldn't hear but clearly understood from their rigid shoulders and sharp gestures. Finally the servants, scurrying away with empty platters and the nervous energy of people who'd just witnessed their commander's face turn to carved ice. Only I remained on the dais, stationed there by accident of duty rotation. My fingers were sticky with something strange and slightly warm, the small, foreign object I'd pulled from behind his ear, now wrapped hastily in the corner of my kerchief. My knees threatened to buckle, waiting for the floor to open and swallow me whole. It wasn't the floor that moved. It was the guards. On your feet. One of them growled, gauntleted hand closing around my upper arm hard enough to bruise. I stumbled upward, the world too bright and sharp-edged around me. Somewhere below us in the chamber, voices rose in shock and confusion, louder than I'd ever heard in this fortress, as if volume itself had become something new and frightening. I risked a glance at Kael. His eyes were not on the dispersing crowd. They were fixed on me with an intensity that made my breath catch. Before, his gaze had been analytical, distant, a tactician assessing terrain. Now it burned, pinned me like an insect to cork, searching my face as if I'd just revealed myself as something completely unknown. He blinked hard, and even that small sound, the wet click of eyelids meeting, seemed to startle him. Then he jerked his chin once, a sharp command. "Bring her," he said. I had never heard his voice before. It was low and rough-edged, like stone grinding against stone in an avalanche. It rolled through the air and settled in my bones, and for one absurd heartbeat I forgot that words could mean danger. I only thought, so this is what he sounds like. Then the guards were hauling me from the chamber and the moment shattered. We climbed narrow stairs, each footfall echoing against spiral walls. My heart tried to climb faster than my feet, hammering against my ribs. I could still see his face when sound first reached him, the way his eyes had gone wide, how he'd flinched from the torch crackling beside the dais as if fire had suddenly grown teeth. I had done that to him. Fool, I thought. Interfering fool. The guards said nothing. Their fingers bit into my arms with promises of bruises. At the top of the stairs, a heavy door stood open, flanked by two more armored figures. Beyond it lay chambers I had only glimpsed from a distance while on patrol routes. The commander's private quarters. They shoved me inside like tossing scraps to a wolf. The door boomed shut behind me, the sound loud enough to make me jump. The room was large but felt smaller for his presence in it. Tapestries covered the stone, mountain peaks and ancient battles, wolves and eagles in woven silence. A broad desk stood near the windows, covered in maps and markers. Weapon racks lined one wall, a bed another, its frame carved from dark wood. Kael stood with his back to me, hands braced on the desk edge, shoulders rigid. He'd removed his formal armor. In its place he wore a dark tunic that clung to the muscles of his back, practical leather braces on his forearms. His hair had come partially loose from its tie. "You may leave," he said, and though the words were quiet, they carried easily to the guards outside. The door opened, closed. We were alone. My mouth went dry. This was worse than facing him in the council chamber. Alone, there would be no witnesses to whatever judgment he chose. A commander didn't need an audience to make a border guard disappear. He didn't turn immediately. I watched his shoulders rise and fall, slow and deliberate, as if he were listening to his own breathing for the first time. His head tilted slightly, the gesture of someone catching an unfamiliar scent on the wind. "I can hear the wind," he said at last, voice low and wondering. "Through the stones." I never knew it had a voice. I swallowed hard. "Commander, don't speak yet." He lifted one hand, not quite a command, more like a plea. "I want to hear it. The room without your voice in it." So I stood silent while he listened. The fire popped in the hearth. Fabric rustled in a draft from the window. Somewhere above, a shutter creaked against its hinges. My own breathing sounded harsh to my ears. To his, it must have been thunder. He turned then, and his eyes were the same storm gray they'd always been, but something restless moved behind them now. Not the distant calculation I'd seen from across training yards, but a raw, startled awareness, as if every part of him had been forced awake at once. He took one step toward me. The floorboards made a faint protesting sound under his boots. His gaze flicked downward, as though surprised the floor had opinions. "What?" he asked quietly. "Did you do to me?" Every instinct screamed at me to drop into a submissive crouch, to apologize, to beg. Instead, I forced myself to stand straight, hands knotted at my sides. I had touched him without permission. Whatever happened now, I owed him truth. "I removed something, Commander," I said, hearing my voice shake. "From behind your ear." His jaw clenched. "I know that much." He closed the distance between us in 2 strides, stopping close enough that I had to tilt my head back to meet his eyes. I smelled leather and clean sweat and something sharp like ozone before a storm. "Do you think I haven't had physicians examining my ears since childhood?" he asked. The words had edges. "Do you think a border guard saw what they could not?" The words were harsh, but underneath them I heard something else, now that my terror had parted enough to let sound through. Hurt. Disbelief. A tremor he was trying to crush flat with anger. "I don't know what they saw, Commander," I whispered. "I only know what I felt." His eyes narrowed. "Felt?" "Yes." My fingers twitched around the kerchief still clutched in my hand. I forced them open, revealing the small, twisted thing wrapped inside, the strange object that had been lodged behind his ear like a stone blocking a stream. "When I stood behind you in the chamber, something pulled at me. Here." I touched the center of my chest, over my sternum, like it does when a bone is set wrong, or when infection hides under skin. It was wrong. I could feel it even before I saw it. He stared at the object in my palm. For a long moment, he said nothing. The fire cracked. Wind pressed against the window glass. "And you decided," he said, so softly I almost missed it, "to put your hands on your commander in front of the entire council because something felt wrong." "I decided," I said, voice barely more than breath, "that I would rather face execution for trying to fix what I couldn't bear to watch than live knowing I stayed silent." The confession fell between us, heavier than the granite beneath our feet. My heart hammered loud enough that I was certain it shook my ribs. His gaze lifted from my hand to my face, searching. "Say that again," he murmured. My lips felt clumsy. "I would rather face execution." "No." He stepped closer still, until the hem of my guard's tunic nearly brushed his boots. "Not the words. The way you said them." I blinked, confused. "I don't understand." His eyes darkened with focus. "Your voice changed. When you spoke of execution, it stayed level. But when you said you couldn't bear to watch," he shook his head slightly. "It broke." Understanding dawned slowly. His hearing was new, raw. Every quiver, every breath, every subtle shift in tone was a discovery. He was learning to read sound the way he'd learned to read faces, cataloging meanings in each variation. He lifted his hand slowly, fingers hovering near my throat without quite touching. "When you spoke of dying, your voice came from here," he said, indicating my chest. "But when you said you couldn't bear to watch, it rose. Higher, tighter." Heat climbed my neck. "Because that part is worse," I admitted hoarsely. His hand dropped. He stepped back as if distance might help him think. "I can hear your heart," he said. "It's loud. I'm afraid." "I know." His mouth twisted in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Mine is louder." The thought startled me enough that my eyes flew to his chest. I couldn't hear his heartbeat from where I stood, but perhaps he meant the rush in his own ears, the thunder of blood through newly opened channels of sense. He turned away, pacing once, twice, the floor complaining softly under his steps. "Physicians told me the injury happened during a raid when I was a child," he said. "That what was taken by trauma could not be returned by mortal means." He looked back at me, shadows gathering in his expression. "Yet you," his gaze dropped to the kerchief in my palm. "Do you know what this is?" "No, Commander." "Neither do I." His jaw flexed. "But I intend to find out." He came to stand before me again, all uncertainty buried beneath the returning mantle of command. His newly awakened senses didn't make him smaller. If anything, they sharpened the edges of his presence. "You will not be sent away," he said. Shock stole my breath. What? His eyes held mine, unblinking. Until I understand what was done to me, and how you undid part of it, you will remain in this keep. His mouth curved, not in warmth, but in something like grim practicality. I need someone whose words I can hear and whose fear makes them honest. That stung, but it was also, I knew, the only reason I was still breathing. You will continue your duties, he went on. But when I summon you, you will come. If this thing was placed deliberately, I will need a guide. He seemed to taste the word, unfamiliar. Someone who feels what others miss. I'm only a border guard, I said weakly. He studied me for a long moment. You are the first person who has ever changed the world beneath my skin. My throat tightened. I bowed my head at last, because I didn't know what else to do with words like that. As you command, Commander. He exhaled slowly, and I heard it, softer than wind, but present. Go, he said, before your heart batters its way free of your ribs. I backed toward the door, legs shaking. My hand closed tighter around the kerchief and its terrible secret. As I slipped into the corridor, one thought beat louder than my pulse. I had walked into the predator's den expecting to die. Instead, I had been claimed, not as prey, not yet as anything so gentle as trusted, but as something far more dangerous. I had become necessary. The keep didn't grow quieter once Kael began to hear it. It only grew more honest. On the first morning after the council incident, I was summoned, not to the strategy rooms or the training yards, but to a smaller chamber off the main corridor. A study, with high narrow windows and shelves lined with reports he had probably read by sight alone for years. A fire burned low in the hearth, consuming a log that hissed and popped. He stood by the window when I entered, back straight, hands clasped behind him. No formal armor today, just a dark tunic, leather braces, and a tension that seemed to hold every muscle one breath away from snapping. Close the door, he said without turning. The latch clicked louder than I expected. He flinched, barely, but I saw it. Everything is loud, he muttered. Even my own fortress. I stayed near the door, uncertain how close I was permitted to stand when he wasn't demanding answers about mysterious objects lodged in his flesh. It can be, I said carefully, if you don't know what you're hearing. He looked over his shoulder then, studying me with that new sharpness, as if he could listen with his eyes as well as his ears. You said you would rather die than stay silent, he said. Prove you meant it. My throat tightened. How? Teach me. He gestured vaguely at the room, at himself, at the stone around us. All of this. I had taught younger guards once how to read weather patterns in cloud movements, how to hear the difference between rockfall and footsteps in mountain passes. But teaching a commander to hear his own world was something else entirely. Still, I stepped away from the door. If fate had placed me in this madness, I wouldn't dishonor it by cowering. Start with the fire, I said. He frowned. The fire. It has a voice. I walked to the hearth, gesturing for him to follow. Listen. He came to stand beside me, nearer than was comfortable, closer than protocol would call proper. His arm brushed mine. The contact sent a bright, unwelcome heat through me that I forced myself to ignore. I focused on the flames. Do you hear that sharp crack? That's where the wood is driest, where the grain splits. The softer hiss is sap boiling away. It tells you how long the log will last. He tilted his head, eyes narrowing in concentration. He paused. Yes, there's more than one sound. Good. I couldn't help the small smile. Now the chimney. Listen higher. His gaze lifted, following the line of stone upward. Wind tugged at the smoke, making it moan low and hollow through the flue. His brows drew together. It sounds lonely, he said slowly. Frustrated, I corrected gently. That's wind complaining about being trapped. Something eased in his shoulders, as if the world had just become a fraction less hostile by being named. Chapter 3. That became our pattern in the days that followed. When he summoned me, it was always to some corner of the keep. Never the grand halls, never the formal spaces, but places where sound pooled and curled. A stairwell where footsteps overlapped and echoed. A balcony where wind and distant voices argued. The armory before dawn when steel being sharpened sang against whetstones. This, I would say, pointing toward a distant clatter, is equipment being stacked, not worn. Hear how it tumbles, no rhythm to it. And this, he would counter, tipping his head toward the courtyard below, hooves on stone. 3 horses, not 2. The third is lighter, probably unburdened. I would listen, then nod. You're learning faster than I did. You were born to it, he replied once. I'm only now meeting my own kingdom. Sometimes the lessons were simple, almost laughably so. The difference between a door closing in anger and one caught gently by a careful hand. The sound of genuine laughter in the barracks versus the brittle politeness at formal dinners. The hiss of a blade leaving its sheath compared to the scrape of metal being cleaned. Other times they felt like walking a cliff edge in darkness. One evening he called me to his quarters just as torches were being lit along the battlements. Shadows pooled thick in the corners, soft and concealing. He sat on the edge of his bed, elbows on his knees, staring at his open hands as if they belonged to someone else. It won't stop, he said without preamble. The noise, even when the room is empty. I hesitated in the doorway. What do you hear? He shook his head, jaw tight. Everything. The fire, the guards outside, wind through the mountains, my own breathing. I cannot tell where one sound ends and the next begins. His voice was wrong, too fast, too thin. I felt the edge of panic in it, sharp along my nerves. May I asked, stepping closer. He didn't look up, but he didn't forbid me either. I took that as permission and came to stand before him. From this angle, with his head bowed, he looked younger somehow. Less like the untouchable commander and more like a man drowning in sensation he'd never been taught to navigate. Kael, I said softly, using his name for the first time. His eyes snapped up, blown wide. It's too loud, he rasped. The world is too loud and I don't know where to put it all. Give the noise somewhere to go, I said. Trust me. I took his hands, both of them, in mine. It was a boldness that would have terrified me a week ago. Now, terror was a luxury I couldn't afford. I guided his palms to my chest, laying them flat over my heart. His fingers spanned nearly the whole width of my ribcage. The heat of his skin burned through the fabric of my tunic. Feel that? I asked. He swallowed hard. Yes. That's me. Not the wind, not the guards, not the fire. Just me. I drew a slow breath, letting my ribs expand deliberately. Breathe with my heart. When it beats twice, breathe in. Out for the third. This is foolish, he muttered, but his hands didn't pull away. Then humor your foolish guide, I murmured. In. Out. Listen only here. His chest rose, fell, rose again. At first his breath stuttered, catching on the edges of fear. Gradually, the rhythm settled. My heartbeat slowed with his. Or perhaps his slowed with mine. I couldn't tell anymore where one pulse ended and the other began. The roar in his eyes dimmed, leaving something rawer, more fragile. What do you hear now? I asked after several cycles. He stared at me, gaze dropping briefly to our joined hands before returning to my face. You, he said quietly. Only you. The room felt suddenly too small. My own lungs forgot their lesson, stumbling. His hands moved, whether by accident or intent, I couldn't say, sliding slightly over the curve of my ribs as my breath hitched. Your voice changes, he added, softer still. When you're frightened for me, it steadies. When you're frightened of me, it thins. Just now it did something else. Heat rushed to my cheeks. I'm not accustomed to commanders touching me, sir. Commanders, he said, as if tasting the word. You say it as if I'm made of stone. You're not stone. The admission slipped out before I could bite it back. Stone doesn't flinch when doors slam. Stone doesn't hold its breath when it hears footsteps approaching. His fingers curled unconsciously, pressing closer. My heart, the traitor, leapt against his palms. And what does a guide do, he asked quietly, when her commander won't let go because her heartbeat is the only sound that makes sense? My mouth parted, but no words came. Instead, I placed my own hands over his, anchoring them where they lay. It was a dangerous answer, but an honest one. We stayed like that longer than was wise. Long enough for the fire to settle into embers. For the corridor beyond to fall quiet as the keep slipped toward sleep. Long enough for our breathing to become a single rhythm neither of us wanted to break. After that night, the lessons changed. I still taught him the language of the fortress. The distant rumble of supply wagons on the approach road, the clatter of dice in the guard house, the secretive hush of conspirators who forgot walls had ears now. But there were more moments when his attention slipped from the world around us to me. Say my name again, he would ask, leaning close under the pretense of needing to hear better. Kael, I would whisper, knowing full well he could have heard me from across the room. Sometimes he would repeat it, testing the weight of each sound, matching his tone to mine. Once, I placed my hand on his throat to help him feel the vibration, to guide the sound. The first time his voice matched my pitch so closely, the air seemed to hum between us. I had to pull away before I did something foolish like press my lips to the place my fingers had just rested. Duty said I was there to serve, to guide, to steady. Desire said I was already falling. He never spoke of bonds or claims. I never spoke of the pull I felt whenever he entered a room, the way my pulse quickened at his scent, the dreams I'd started having where his hands stayed on my skin long after lessons ended. But the space between us grew charged with things unsaid. Glances that lingered a heartbeat too long. Hands that brushed when they didn't need to. Silences heavy not with absence, but with everything we were too afraid to name. I had promised myself once that I would never interfere again, that I would keep my head down and survive by being unremarkable. Then I tore the silence from his ear. Now each lesson in sound felt like a new kind of interference, one that didn't merely change his world, but wove mine irrevocably into it. Doors in the keep were thinner than they looked. I learned this while carrying reports to an antechamber 2 nights after I'd taught Kael to breathe with my heartbeat. The corridor outside the officer's planning room was nearly empty, all but one torch guttering low in its sconce. I knew better than to linger near that door. It was where senior personnel discussed things border guards weren't meant to hear. But the duty officer had sent me with documents for the watch commander, and the watch commander had stepped away, and I made the mistake of existing within earshot when voices rose on the other side of the oak. "We cannot pretend this is nothing." A clipped voice hissed through the gap. "Captain Vaughn," if I matched the tone to the thin slash of his mouth. A deaf commander is one thing. A hearing one is an entirely different threat. A deeper voice, oily with false calm, answered. "Your concern is noted, Vaughn. But the change is done. We cannot extract the sound from his skull." The documents trembled in my hands. I pressed my back against the cold stone, letting shadow swallow me. The urge to flee warred with the part of me that had spent years listening by necessity. Every raised voice a warning, every whispered argument a sign it was time to move to a new post. "If he starts hearing what's not meant for him," Vaughn said, "these walls won't protect us. He'll start asking different questions, making different connections." "He's still the same man," the other replied. "Trained to observe, not to listen. He trusts what he reads in faces more than what enters through his ears. With careful guidance." "You mean with you whispering careful lies while that border guard has access to him every evening?" Vaughn spat the words border guard with such disdain I flinched. Don't think I haven't noticed his sudden interest in personnel who were meant to remain invisible. Heat shot to my cheeks, shame and fear tangling. I should have walked away. My feet wouldn't obey. "He relies on her for now," the smoother voice said. "A child clings to the hand that leads him from a dark room. That doesn't make the child any less malleable once his eyes adjust." "Your metaphors grow more insulting by the day, Torvin." Vaughn sighed. We paid well to keep his ears closed. Years of coin, years of careful placement. If he learns that. One of the documents slipped in my grip. The edge caught against another, making a soft, betraying whisper of sound. Silence fell on the other side of the door. Not empty silence, but the full, poised kind that comes just before steel leaves a sheath. "Did you hear that?" someone muttered. My heart leapt into my throat. I hurried down the corridor as quietly as someone with shaking hands could manage, turning the corner before the door opened behind me. I pressed myself into a supply alcove, breath sawing in my lungs, listening to boots enter the hallway. Pause. Retreat. Paid. They had paid someone to keep him deaf. Not an old injury. Not trauma from a childhood raid. Coin. Coin and fear and the selfish convenience of controlling a commander who couldn't hear their scheming. By the time I reached the barracks, the documents were rattling in my hands. A fellow guard took them from me with a frown, muttering something about getting more sleep. I barely heard her. The roar in my ears was my own pulse. On my bunk that night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Kael's face in the firelight as he tried to separate one sound from another. The way his brow furrowed when the world became overwhelming. The way he softened when I spoke low and steady, anchoring him. He trusts what he reads in faces, the man in the planning room had said. True enough. But he had started to trust my voice too. If physicians had been paid to keep him deaf, then every examination he'd had as a child, every solemn shake of the head, every "there's nothing to be done," all of it had been a lie bought with gold. His world had been narrowed on purpose. His isolation was not an accident of war, but a design. My stomach churned. I thought of the veterinarian who had once called me a curse for daring to question his methods, how easily a garrison had believed him over a scared beater. If these men discovered I had overheard their crime, what might they call me? Spy, manipulator, a beater using strange senses to twist the commander's mind. The worst part was that some of it, from the outside, might look true. I was spending hours alone with Kael now, teaching him to listen, to sort sounds, to hear the tremor in a liar's voice. My scent would cling to his quarters. My voice would echo in his thoughts long after I left. If someone wanted a story to turn him against me, they already had all the pieces. I turned on my side, staring at shadows on the stone ceiling. Leave, a cold, practical voice inside me whispered. Take your pay. Find a caravan heading south. Vanish into some village where commanders are rumors and keeps are just stories. Another voice, quieter, stubborn, answered. And what then? What of the man who placed his hands on your chest like a drowning man grabbing for shore? What of the commander whose first true panic happened in front of you, not his officers, because he couldn't bear for them to see him shaken? What of his careful smile when he finally matched your tone on his own name? He's still the same man, I whispered to the darkness. Except he wasn't. Not entirely. The old Kael had ruled and controlled silence, wrapped in reputation and distance. This one was freshly opened to a world of noise he'd never been prepared for. Sound had stripped some of his armor, not the kind hammered from steel, but the kind built from isolation and unknowability. I had seen beneath that armor. I had watched his face soften when he heard a dog barking in the kennels for the first time, crouching to listen with wonder entirely at odds with his reputation. I had seen exasperation spark in his eyes when two guards tried to whisper about gambling debts outside his line of sight, forgetting their voices now betrayed them. Most dangerous of all, I had seen the way his expression warmed when I entered a room, as if some part of him had learned my footsteps and decided they were worth anticipating. The thought of leaving him in the hands of men who had paid for his isolation made my chest ache worse than any fear of what they might do to me. Yet that fear was real. If they had spent years buying his deafness, what would they do to protect that investment? A border guard could vanish easily in a fortress like this. One night on patrol, the next tumbled over a cliff and written off as a misstep in darkness. Beaters were always falling, always losing their footing, always meeting unfortunate ends that no one questioned too closely. I pressed my palm over my racing heart, remembering the weight of his hands there. Give the noise somewhere to go, I had told him. Trust me. He had. If I ran now, I would be throwing that trust back in his face and handing his newly opened ears to the very people who had tried to keep them sealed. I'm tired of being afraid, I whispered. The darkness didn't answer, but the words settled in me like a small, stubborn stone. Leaving would be safer. Staying might kill me. But safety had never given anyone back their world. In the morning, when the summons came, one of his runners breathless at the barracks door, stammering that Commander Kael requires your presence at once, I wiped my hands on my trousers, straightened my shoulders, and went. Each step up the tower felt like threading a needle through layers of stone and secrets. As I climbed, I heard the keep differently now. The hurried, guilty quiet when I passed certain doors. The too careful loudness of men laughing near the planning room. The brittle note of fear in voices when they spoke the word commander. Behind it all lay another sound, faint but steady, like a drum beating beneath earth. Kael's presence. Not his heartbeat. I wasn't close enough for that yet, but the awareness that somewhere above me, he was listening too. For his first winter with hearing. For lies he'd never been allowed to detect before. For the one person foolish enough to stand between a commander and the people who had stolen his silence. At his chamber door, I paused for a single breath. Run, the old fear whispered one last time. I knocked instead. Chapter 4. Names are heavier when you can finally hear them. We were in the map room the first time Kael told me that. The table between us was scattered with wooden markers carved into wolves and eagles, their positions marking borders I would never patrol. Outside, rain drummed against the shutters, a steady rhythm on stone. Before, he said, fingers tracing the edge of the mountain range carved into parchment. All of this was shapes and moving mouths. His thumb dragged across a painted river. They would say, the commander has spoken, and I would wonder if I had. I stood on the other side of the table, a careful distance away, holding a cup of water the steward had insisted I bring, as if I'd been invited here as something more than his strange new tutor in sound. What do you mean? I asked. He huffed a breath that might have been a laugh in someone else. A man who cannot hear his own voice is always guessing at its reach. He glanced up. I learned early to shape my mouth the way my tutors wanted. To keep my expression controlled, unreadable. They assured me I sounded like a leader. His gaze drifted back to the map. But I never knew. To me, my words were just warmth in my throat and air on my tongue. No weight. No echo. I thought of him in the council chamber, issuing orders with a face like carved granite while the room reacted in ways he could only interpret through visual cues. A commander speaking into fog, hoping the shapes he made reached someone. It must have been lonely, I said quietly. His hand stilled on the parchment. You say that, he murmured, as if it were past tense. The rain grew louder, or perhaps the silence between us did. He straightened, pushing away from the table. When you took that thing from my ear, the first sound I truly knew as mine was not a cheer or a command. He stepped around the table, each bootful a deliberate soft thud on the stone floor. It was my own breathing. I thought, so this is the man they call Commander. Just a creature struggling for air like any other. I wanted to reach for him then, the way I would have for anyone who'd just learned the sky wasn't solid. Instead, I gripped my cup tighter. My hands were safer when they were occupied. You are not just any creature, I said. His mouth curved, not quite mockery, not quite gratitude. The officers say that as well, though they mean it differently. He came to stand beside me, close enough that I could smell rain on his tunic where droplets had soaked the fabric at his shoulders. When you speak, I can hear doubt and honesty at war in your voice. That sounds inconvenient, I murmured. It's clarifying. His gaze dropped to my lips, then flicked away, almost shy. Kael, shy. The notion was absurd. Yet there it was, in the slight hitch of his breath. Say something else. My mind went blank. Of all the words in the fortress, none came. What should I say? His voice roughened. Say it again. What should I say? He closed his eyes. For a long moment he simply stood there, listening as if those 4 plain words held secrets. It's different when you're not instructing me on where to listen, he said. Your voice when you're teaching is firm, steady. When you're uncertain, his eyes opened. It rises. Just slightly. At the end. I didn't realize I did that, I said, heat climbing my neck. You do many things you don't realize. He took the cup from my hands and set it aside on the table, leaving my fingers empty and exposed. Like what? He looked away, as if the maps on the wall suddenly fascinated him. When he spoke next, the words came softer than the rain. Say my name. I had said it before, of course. During lessons when he needed a model, when he asked me to demonstrate proper tone and rhythm. But there was something different in the request now. A vulnerability that made my pulse stumble. Kael, I whispered. He inhaled sharply. Again. Kael. His throat worked. My gaze, traitor that it was, followed the movement. It sounds. He groped for words, a man used to commanding armies, not describing sensations. Different. From commander. As if you're speaking to a man instead of a title. Would you prefer I didn't? No. The answer came too quickly, too raw. His eyes met mine, unguarded. No. I prefer that very much. Something shifted inside me then, like a stone finally rolling into place. I had cared for him before, for his confusion, his pain, his wonder at sounds most people took for granted. But this was different. This was not just wanting him safe. It was wanting to be the one he looked at this way, the one whose voice he marked as separate from all others in his fortress. It was the dangerous, traitorous desire to be special to him, not as a tool or necessity, but as myself, as someone he chose, not someone he needed. Beta, the word tasted both bitter and sweet. In this keep, my designation was supposed to be an advantage, stable, reliable, unlikely to complicate command structures with inconvenient biology. But I had seen officers trade their beta subordinates like furniture, seen promising careers ended because someone with a bloodline wanted a position. If they realized what was growing between us, they wouldn't need elaborate schemes to control the commander. They would only need me, and the threat of what they could do to me. Kael, I said again, because I was a fool who couldn't help herself. His jaw clenched. Your heart is beating faster. I cursed his newly sharp ears. That means I'm alive, Commander. It's beating faster than usual. He glanced down as if just noticing how little space remained between us. His hand lifted, hesitated, then settled on the table edge instead of where I half expected, on my arm, my shoulder, somewhere touch might speak clearer than words. Does my nearness frighten you? Yes, I thought, but not the way you mean. It concerns me, I said carefully. Your enemies would be delighted to see you comfortable with a border guard. They are already whispering. His expression darkened. I'm aware of their whispers. You don't know all of them, I said, thinking of the conversation behind the door. The urge to tell him everything surged up again, about payments to physicians, about years stolen on purpose, about the way they spoke of him as a child with a new toy, about me. The border guard with access to him every evening. I had heard it clearly, the disdain and the danger in equal measure. My tongue pressed against my teeth, words clamoring. I could tell him now. I should. Kael must have seen something in my face because his gaze sharpened. You're holding something back. How was I supposed to confess to betrayal and schemes when he was looking at me as if my honesty were the only solid ground in a world that had just learned to make noise? I began. A sharp knock shattered the moment. We both flinched. Enter, Kael snapped, the commander sliding back over him like armor. The duty officer stepped in, bowing slightly, eyes flicking from Kael to me and back in a way that made my skin crawl. Forgive the interruption, Commander. The senior staff requests your presence in the main hall. For what? The words cracked like a whip. A formal inquiry, the officer said, smoothing his hands down his uniform. Regarding recent changes in your condition and the guard involved. His gaze landed fully on me then, assessing and hungry. It seems prudent that her actions be examined before the full staff. The room tilted. Inquiry. Examined. So many polite words for being dragged into the open like prey. Kael's jaw hardened. Who called for this? The senior officers petitioned as a group, sir. They are concerned. I could hear the truth hiding beneath that word now, thanks to my own lessons. Concern laced with fear, with anticipation of a spectacle. What happens if I refuse? Kael asked, voice dangerously quiet. The officer's smile was thin. Refusal would be unwise, Commander. It might suggest you have something to hide. His eyes slid to me again, pupils narrowing as if he could already see me displayed before the assembled wolves. Better to face questions openly and put all doubts to rest. Kael's hand curled into a fist on the table. For a heartbeat I thought he would overturn it, send maps and markers flying, consequences be damned. Then he inhaled, measured, grudging. Very well. Tell them I'm coming. The officer bowed himself out. The door clicked shut, the sound neat and final. We were alone again, but the intimacy of moments before was gone, swallowed by the looming weight of judgment. You'll stand with me, Kael said, and there was something almost apologetic in his gaze, an emotion I never expected to see on a commander's face. My palms were damp. And if they ask questions I can't safely answer. His jaw set. Then they'll learn what a commander sounds like when he's decided he's heard enough. It was a promise and a threat, neither of which I could fully trust to protect me. As we walked toward the hall together, my mind spun in circles. Tell him now. Tell him about the coin, the physicians, the men behind the door. Tell him about your heart before they use it against you. I opened my mouth. The doors to the main hall swung wide before us, and 100 faces turned our way. The sound of voices falling abruptly silent crashed over me like a wave. Whatever words I'd meant to offer drowned on my tongue. They had dressed the hall for judgment instead of ceremony. No banners of victory hung tonight, only the old standards, wolf and mountain, sword and star, staring down like witnesses. Torches burned along the walls, their flames turned into spears of light by the polish of stone. The air tasted of smoke, tension, and something sharper, the metallic tang of anticipation. Kael's usual position sat elevated at the head of the hall, but he didn't take it when we entered. He stood beside it instead, hands clasped behind his back, eyes sweeping the room with the calculated precision I'd come to recognize. The murmur that had filled the space thinned and broke, falling into a hush that felt more dangerous than any shouted accusation. The duty officer led me forward until I stood alone on bare stone at the center of the hall. No reports in my hands, no duty to busy my fingers with, only my own pulse hammering against my ribs. The circle of officers around me parted just enough to keep their polished boots clear of whatever might spill from this spectacle. Let it be known, Captain Vaughn said, stepping from the crowd like a blade from a sheath, that this gathering is called in concern for the safety of this keep and the soundness of our commander's judgment. Murmurs rippled through the assembly. I heard the falseness in them now, the rehearsed outrage, the pleased anticipation poorly disguised as worry. Kael's gaze flicked to Vaughn, then to me. He gave no signal, no word, but I felt him listening. To them, to me, to all of it. Vaughn turned, uniform whispering. "The guard," he said, as if I didn't already stand before him in plain sight. "Step forward." I didn't move. There was nowhere further to go. "State your name," he ordered. "Rylen," I said, amazed my voice emerged at all. "Beta, border guard of the 3rd rotation." Vaughn's mouth curved in something approximating a smile. "And self-appointed physician to the commander." "I never claimed to be a physician," I said quietly. "Yet you admit you put your hands upon the commander during a council session." "Yes." My fingers curled at my sides. "I do." Gasps fluttered through the hall, false as painted flowers. Kael's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, watching. "And did you have permission to touch your commanding officer?" Vaughn asked. "No." The word dropped like a stone into deep water. He spread his hands, turning to the crowd. "There you have it. A beta, unranked, unsworn to any particular service, laying hands on our commander in a place of official business. And for what purpose, we must ask." His lip curled. "Compassion, or something more arcane." The words slithered through the hall like oil. "Arcane." Someone near the pillars made a warding gesture. Another whispered something that sounded like unnatural. A third, softer, said manipulation. Vaughn faced Kael's position again. "Commander, we all witnessed the result. One moment you sat as you always have, controlled, steady, as your injury made you. The next, at this guard's touch, you clutched your head, flinched at sounds, reacted to things that were not there." He tilted his head with false sympathy. "How can we be certain she hasn't tampered with your mind? With your will?" Kael descended one step from his position, but no further. "My mind remains my own," he said, voice low and even. "Speak your accusation plainly, Captain." "Very well." Vaughn's eyes gleamed. "I accuse this beta of using whatever unnatural sense she possesses to alter what injury and time decreed. Of using proximity to cloud your judgment." His gaze slid to me, sharp with satisfaction. "How else do we explain your sudden attachment? You summon her privately. You defend her openly. You allow her to stand where no common guard should stand, at your side." Heat climbed my neck. Interest rippled through the hall like wind through grain. The accusation was poison wrapped in truth. Kael's eyes found mine. For a heartbeat, the hall fell away. I saw the question there. "Do you want me to end this? To silence them?" "No," I thought the word loud in my chest. "Not yet." "Commander," I said, and the title tasted different now, less distance, more plea. "May I speak?" He hesitated, then inclined his head slightly. "You may." All those faces turned toward me like flowers to cold sun. There was no warmth in them, only hunger. My knees wanted to buckle. My throat wanted to close. 100 lessons in invisibility screamed for me to bow, to apologize, to beg. I straightened my spine instead. "You ask why I touched him," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "I'll tell you." Vaughn snorted. "We know why. Ambition. Opportunity. A chance to wrap a commander around your—" I was tired. I cut in, the words rising like a wave held back too long. "Of watching a good man struggle while cowards profited from his limitations." The hall went utterly still. I had never called him good aloud before. The truth of it made my chest hurt. "I have served in postings where broken men ruled," I went on. "Men who twisted their pain into cruelty, who used whatever power they had to grind others beneath their boots. Kael is not such a man." Chapter 5. He was given a command and a cage at once, this keep, these walls, and silence wrapped around his head like iron. I looked at Vaughn, at the ring of officers beyond him, and you all learned how to use that silence. How to speak without being heard. How to sell his deafness as old injury while it kept you safe from accountability. A stir of anger rippled through the crowd, not because I was wrong, but because I wasn't supposed to say it where the torches could hear. "You claim I used unnatural abilities," I said. "But when I removed that object from behind his ear, what happened? Did the sky darken? Did the mountains shake?" I shook my head. "No. The world did what it has always done. It made noise." I turned to Kael then, my voice softening without permission. He heard his own breath, his own name, the wind that has guarded these mountains for generations. That is not manipulation. That is what should have been his since birth. I swallowed, feeling the first crack in my composure. You want to know why I risked touching him without permission? Eyes. So many eyes. Kael's most of all. Because I knew I might die, I whispered. I have seen what happens to guards who forget their place. I knew that one misstep could see me thrown from these walls and forgotten before my body stopped falling. My voice wavered, then steadied, riding the tremor like a boat on rough water. And still, when I saw him, this man you call Commander, sitting in a hall full of voices he couldn't hear, carrying a burden he'd never been allowed to understand. I took a breath that scraped my lungs raw. One look was enough. I forced the next words through a throat that wanted to close. He was worth saving. The last word broke on my tongue. A sound escaped Kael, too contained to be a gasp, too rough to be a laugh. I didn't dare meet his eyes now. If I did, I might say everything. Might tell them all that I loved him, that the thought of him locked back into silence hurt more than any blade. Worth, Vaughn repeated, latching onto the word like a predator onto blood. You speak as if you sat in judgment over him. No. I shook my head, tears burning behind my eyes. I speak as someone who understands what it is to be voiceless. I didn't judge him. I saw him drowning in enforced quiet, and I reached. The tears escaped then, hot tracks down my cheeks. I didn't wipe them away. Let them see. Let them hear. If you must accuse me of something, I said, and now my voice crackled like dry wood catching flame. Accuse me of that. Of refusing to stand still while a commander was kept half alive for your convenience. Of choosing action over fear. My gaze swept the circle, catching on each face, daring them to look away. I broke the rules of rank and protocol and self-preservation. I touched what many of you believed untouchable. My throat closed on the next words. I forced them through anyway. I did it knowing it could cost me my life, I said. And if that is what this hall decides, if you choose to execute me for helping him, then so be it. My voice cracked cleanly on that last syllable. The sound rang up into the rafters and down into the stones beneath my feet. I would rather be executed for trying to give my commander back what was stolen from him, I whispered, than live another day knowing I saw his suffering and did nothing. Silence fell, real silence, for once. Not the hollow quiet that had wrapped Kael all his life, but a held breath waiting. Every eye swung to where Kael stood. I finally looked too. He stood at the edge of his position, knuckles white at his sides. His gaze was fixed on me with a fierceness that made my knees want to fold. Not in fear this time, but in something far more dangerous. He had heard every word. The question hanging over us now was simple and terrible. What sound would a commander make in answer? The silence after my words was the loudest thing I had ever heard. No one moved. No one breathed. Or if they did, I couldn't hear it over the rush in my own ears. All that existed was Kael, standing above me, staring down as if I had split his chest open and laid his heart on the stone floor. He took one step down from his position. The sound of his boot on the stair rang like a struck bell. Verdict, my fear whispered. Another step. Leather against stone, a soft scrape I had come to know in dark corridors and quiet rooms. Each footfall brought his scent closer, steel and rain and something uniquely him, sharp and clean beneath it all. My throat tightened. By the fourth step, my vision had begun to blur. I kept my chin lifted anyway. If he chose to cast me out, I would meet it standing. I had broken his silence without permission. He owed me nothing. He stopped in front of me, so close the edge of his cloak brushed my uniform. From this angle, he towered, every inch the commander carved into legends. The hall watched, 100 eyes hiding 100 wishes for my punishment, my banishment, my humiliation. Kael's gaze moved over my face, taking in the tears, the set of my jaw, the way my hands shook at my sides. His own hands opened and closed once, as if steadying himself against some unseen current. Then he did something no one in that hall expected. He reached for me. His fingers found my hand, rough and warm, closing around it firmly enough that the tremor running through me had no choice but to still. Gasps rippled outward like thrown stones hitting water. Look at them, he said quietly, though the sound carried easily to the furthest corner. Listen. I did. The murmurs were no longer smug, no longer gleeful. They were shocked, disbelieving, edged with dawning fear. Kael turned, still holding my hand, and faced his assembled staff. You have heard her, he said. Now you will hear me. His voice rolled through the hall, deeper and more certain than I had ever heard it. This was a man who finally believed his words reached their mark. You speak of unnatural interference, he went on. If there is any manipulation at work here, it was done long before she ever set foot in this keep. His gaze swept the offices, cold as winter. Someone placed a foreign object behind my ear when I was a child. Someone paid to keep me deaf, to keep me ignorant of the voices around me, my own enemies, my own name. A shiver passed through the crowd. No one spoke. I have listened, Kael said, harsher now. Not just with my newly opened ears, but with the skills you all taught me in silence. How to read fear. How to smell guilt. His eyes caught and pinned Vaughn, who flinched despite himself. Rylen did not twist fate. She tore out a man-made chain disguised as injury. He lifted our joined hands just enough that everyone could see. The only thing she used, he said, voice softening around the edges, was courage. My breath caught. She touched a commander with no promise of reward, no protection, knowing it might mean her death. His jaw flexed. How many of you can say the same? How many of you have risked your lives to give me something rather than to take something from me? No one answered. Torches snapped in the hush. Somewhere a banner creaked. This inquiry is over, Kael declared. If you want to find fault, look among those who profited from my isolation, not among those who ended it. He released my hand only long enough to turn back to me. You will not be punished, he said, loud enough for all to hear. You will not be cast out. From this day forward, anyone who moves against you moves against their commander. The words wrapped around me like armor and a collar all at once. Protection and claim in the same breath. He squeezed my fingers once more, then led me from the center of the hall, up the steps to stand beside his position. The murmur began again behind us. Not triumph this time, but the restless whisper of a story changing shape. I could feel their eyes burning between my shoulder blades as I walked beside him. A voice beside the commander. They would call me. A dangerous place for someone who had spent her life trying to be invisible. When the doors finally closed behind the last officer and the echoes faded, Kael sagged against his chair as if the wood were the only thing holding him up. The great hall, emptied of bodies, hummed with residual noise only he could hear. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. My hand still tingled where his had held it. I should have done more, he said at last, voice rough. They will not stop with whispers. You did enough, I replied, surprised to find my voice steady again. You made them afraid of the right thing. And what is that? You. I managed a small smile. A commander who finally hears them. Something flickered in his eyes. Pain, pride, something tender that made me want to look away and never look away again. Rylen, he murmured. Yes, Commander. He swallowed, the sound of it somehow loud in the emptied hall. Then, slowly, he stepped down from his position until we stood on the same level, stone beneath both our feet instead of rank between us. To my shock, he sank to one knee, then the other. Stop that, I whispered, horrified. You cannot kneel to me. Why not? His gaze never left my face. You were willing to die for me. Should I not at least bend for you? His hands closed gently around my wrists, as if afraid I would bolt. The sight of a kneeling commander made my head spin. When you stood there, he said softly, in front of all of them, saying you would rather be executed than stand by in silence, do you know what I heard? Treason. I tried for humor. It came out thin. Life, he said simply. For the first time, the sound of it in my own chest meant something. It matched yours. My throat tightened. I have heard many things since you freed my ears, he went on. Wind, rain, steel, lies. But your voice. He shook his head, almost helpless. Your voice is the first sound that ever made me feel truly alive. The hall seemed to tilt around us. I could order you to stay, he said. I am a commander. I control this keep. I could wrap your future in duty and call it protection. His grip on my wrists loosened. But I am tired of taking things that are not freely given. He looked up at me, this fearsome legend of a man who suddenly had too much sound in his world and chose in this moment to offer all his power to a beater. So I am asking, Kael said, not as your commander, but as the man you decided was worth saving. Will you stay by my side? Not as a subordinate, not as a tool, but as, he exhaled, the word clearly difficult, as mine. I could feel the shape of my answer in every part of me, in the way my pulse leapt at his nearness, in the way my palms itched to touch his face, to smooth the furrow from his brow, in the way the idea of walking away now felt like slicing my own soul in half. Fear rose one last time, hissing all its old warnings about courts and leverage and how easily a beta could be turned into a weapon. But something stronger rose too, quieter and infinitely more powerful. I don't know how to be anything but afraid here, I whispered. But I know how to be stubborn, and I know how to listen. I lifted my hands from his grip and set them against his face. Stubble rasped warmly against my palms. He leaned into the touch as if he had been waiting for it all his life. I choose you, I said. The words rang like a vow. I choose the danger and the beauty and whatever storms come with you. I will stay, if you promise to let me keep teaching you to listen. His breath shuddered. To what? To the keep. To conspirators. To the world. My thumbs brushed the line of his jaw, bold now, claimed by the choice I had made. And to your own heart when it says things your pride doesn't want to hear. A rough sound left him, half laugh, half broken exhale. His hands rose, circling my waist, drawing me closer. Teach me then, he murmured. Listen, I whispered back, and I kissed him softly, carefully, as if he were another new sound I was introducing him to. His lips were warm and uncertain at first, then surer as he leaned up into me. The hall, the court, the dangers waiting outside the doors, all of it fell away beneath the thunder of our joined hearts. When we finally parted, his forehead rested against my stomach, his arms banded around me. I threaded my fingers into his hair, feeling the tremor still running through him. We will make them listen too, he said quietly. To you. To us. I looked down at him, the commander who had been born into silence and chose in the end to kneel for something real, and felt something like hope settle over the stones. Then we begin, I said, with this.